In October of 1907, having recently resigned from his post as the director of the Vienna Court Opera and facing a less grounded existence during what would be the final few years of his life, Gustav Mahler traveled to Helsinki to conduct a series of concerts. During his stay, he met frequently with Sibelius, whose music had been gaining increasing international recognition. These meetings made a deep impression on the Finnish composer, which he described years later to a biographer. Mahler and I were together a great deal. His long-standing heart complaint obliged him to lead an ascetic existence, and he was not fond of ceremonial dinners and banquets. We grew close during a number of walks when we talked about all kinds of musical problems, of life and of death. When our conversation touched on the nature of the symphony, I said that I admired its style and severity of form, and the profound logic that created an interconnection between all the motives. Mahler's opinion was just the opposite. No, he said, the symphony must be like the world. It must embrace everything. Mahler once complained that while most composers went through various phases of development, he was cursed with being Gustav Mahler from the start. And if we examine the entirety of his output, we see a remarkable consistency of purpose that's driven by the universal musical vision Mahler described to Sibelius. This is clear from the outset of Mahler's First Symphony, which begins not with a tune or an introductory rhythmic pattern, but instead with the note A, held quietly by the strings over a 7-octave range to create what Mahler called a sound of nature. Thus, the die was cast. Mahler's music would evoke the realities of human experience in the most direct and comprehensive ways, and in doing so, articulate the psychologically based sensibilities of modernism. If there is an aura of innocence about Mahler's First Symphony, it's created by the directness with which he reveals his inner life, a realm in which childhood memories, pantheism, existential fear, ethnic identity, the macabre, and the nostalgic all compete for attention. This diversity of tone and atmosphere, which is often deployed in the abruptly changing manner of a stream of consciousness, is a fundamental characteristic of Mahler's art. In a sense, Mahler's symphonies are neurological operas. His musical narratives are not conventionally linear. Instead, they reflect the Freudian concept of clarity and meaning gradually emerging from the natural chaos of the psyche. This degree of emphasis on human realism in so-called absolute music was quite new in Mahler's time, and it conflicts with the defining idea of art as a taming enterprise, in which nature and natural impulses are organized for the purpose of effective presentation. In this regard, it's interesting to note that much of Mahler's music wasn't met with the sort of outrage that greeted works by Stravinsky and Schoenberg. In fact, the most common reaction was bewilderment, and although the First Symphony is now considered an easily accessible work, it was regarded with incomprehension, not only during Mahler's life, but for many decades after his death. Musicians and listeners didn't know what to make of a symphony that begins with almost 4 minutes of ethereal stillness, punctuated by bits of material that include bird calls, horn calls, and the sounds of a distant military band. One can only imagine the reaction in the deeply anti-Semitic Vienna of 1900, when Mahler conducted the Philharmonic in the Viennese premiere of the First Symphony in the elegant golden hall of the Musikverein, and the audience heard a third movement that begins with a dark, macabre version of the children's song Frère Jacques, that is then followed by a section of klezmer music. And yet, for those who love Mahler's music, this quality of free association is one of the elements that make it so resonant. While his art isn't solely devoted to realism, its aspirational qualities are made more compelling by the vividness with which Mahler articulates the often difficult realities of human existence. Although Mahler was repelled by Nietzsche's assertion that God is dead, his intense awareness of human suffering inevitably led him to question the existence of the divine. And if we look at Mahler's symphonies, both individually and collectively, a pattern emerges that reflects this divided outlook. In almost every case, he begins with an exposition on the painful mysteries of mortality and the purpose of existence. The bulk of the symphony is devoted to the search for an answer, which is eventually found at the work's conclusion. And this answer differs with each symphony. In the second, it's the concept of resurrection. In the Fifth Symphony, it's Bachian counterpoint that reveals the presence of a cosmic order. In the Eighth, it's the creative spirit and the eternal feminine that leads us towards the light. And in the first, nature is the ultimate healer. This struggle between doubt and belief is deeply human, and in Mahler's symphonies it is carried out with an honesty, an intellectual probity, and an all-embracing creativity that continues to inspire musicians and listeners alike.